This is Resident Evil 8 Village. Wait, no, that isn't right. This is Resident Evil 8 Village in VR. And the VR part of that cannot be understated here, for as someone who beat Resident Evil 8 twice in flat, I can confidently tell you that playing RE8 in VR is a completely different experience. This is mandatory VR and one of the finest first-person action titles ever made for VR, and for my money, better than Half Life Alyx. Stick around and I'll tell you why. Hey guys, it's Chris from the VR Grid and welcome to the channel. If you like this video, give it a like for us, and if you're interested in more VR content from us, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss new videos as they drop. And if you're looking to join our VR conversations, feel free to leave a comment, or even better, join us each and every Thursday at 6 p.m. Pacific here for the Virtual Boys podcast. Set a few years after the events in Resident Evil 7 Biohazard, RE8 begins with Ethan Winters and his wife Mia living peacefully in a new location, free from their past nightmares. And just as they are building their new life together, tragedy befalls them once again. Now, I don't want to dive too deep into the story here, as it's almost impossible without giving away spoilers to both RE7 and RE8, as RE8 has some key connections to RE7 that establish who you, your wife Mia, and your child are, and the events surrounding how these characters fit into the Resident Evil universe as a whole. However, what I will say is, despite that key connective tissue with RE7, RE8 is its own flavor of Resident Evil, moving away from that deep south grime of 7 and going back to a tone and setting more in line with the fourth Resident Evil title, and also my personal favorite. Now, while Resident Evil 8 doesn't really get into the occult as heavily as 4, it does see you walking through dark and foreboding forests once again and exploring an abandoned village. Additionally, RE8 sees the series return to the more action-oriented gameplay of RE4 and consequently tones down the horror we experienced in RE7. Now, of course, results will vary depending on how easily you scare, and RE8 is still definitely a horror game, but with werewolves, zombies, and a flair for the supernatural, combined with a literal arsenal of weapons at your disposal, I don't think Resident Evil 8 will scare away players like 7 did. Further to this, while Resident Evil 7 was a fairly linear game with a very curated story, RE8 takes a more semi-open world approach here, using the village as a sort of hub area, where areas will open and close as you progress through the story, giving the game an almost Metroidvania feel at times, as the world design does encourage re-exploring areas, and consequently making RE8 feel much more like a game than RE7 did. RE8 is also less a puzzle game than the previous title, with most puzzles being simple logic puzzles to gain access to new sections of the game. There are a few exceptions though, where the game takes your guns away and goes full retro Resident Evil, making you use your brain, but these are few and far between, coming off as more palate cleansers to the core gameplay loop, which is fairly action focused, though never to the same degree that RE4 and RE5 were. Coming in around the 10-hour mark for gameplay length, Resident Evil 8 starts off slow, starting players in the pitch black darkness of the surrounding forest. Eventually reaching the outskirts of the village and daybreak, players will explore a few small houses in this now abandoned village before running into their first enemy. Though this is just a taste, as I will warn you guys, similar to how Resident Evil 4 treated players in the first hour with that onslaught of villagers, RE8 again throws players literally to the wolves with an early encounter that you simply need to survive in order to proceed. This was not easy when playing flat, and it kicked my ass here in VR, as I had to quickly learn to get good, swapping mags, weapons, crafting, and taking health just to stay alive. I mean, seriously guys, in those opening moments, you will be running through basements, jumping off houses, and running through rivers, all while shooting over your shoulder just to survive. This is sure to scare some off, but I do commend the developers here to not dumb the game down for VR, and instead keeping that trial by fire approach that the flat game did. Thankfully though, the way in which RE8 handles weapon and health management is competent and easy, making combat fun and quick in VR, and rarely got in the way. Apparently taking notes from the VR implementation of Resident Evil 4 on the Quest 2, RE8 feels like the next iteration of that title's weapon holstering and inventory management system, improving on it in most ways. Once again, handgun and ammo placement is on your sides, but further out in front in order to more easily grab them than, say, trying to reach into your waist and find them. Something I especially appreciated as someone who likes to play seated. Again, like RE4 VR, you can place a two-handed weapon over your right shoulder, but RE8 expands on that, allowing players to also place another two-handed weapon on their back waist, and another inside the left part of their jacket. This is also used to store consumables like grenades or landmines. The right inside of the jacket is consequently used to store your flashlight and also doubles up as another holster for another type of consumable. Health potions are on your back left shoulder, and your map is on your back left waist. So, as you can tell, you are loaded down and ready to kill with not a spot of VR space wasted. Thankfully though, once I got used to where to grab, this all worked well, as this could have been a gameplay disaster if they hadn't gotten that right. Jumping into the inventory menu makes switching weapons out super easy, and if you've played Resident Evil 4, then the rest of the menu system here plays much the same, allowing you to sort your inventory, craft items, combine treasure, and examine pickups all within the same VR menu. And it all works flawlessly. Now, if you saw my review for RE4 on the Quest, one of the few issues that I had with the VR implementation of that game was that VR made the game much easier, and in my opinion, too easy. For Resident Evil 4 was a game originally released in 2005, and the VR port didn't seem to adjust for the fact that players were no longer stuck in place when shooting, allowing VR players to literally run circles around enemies. In addition, headshots were a lot easier for anyone that was used to shooting in VR, and this quickly made ammunition scarcity a non-issue. Thankfully, RE8 suffers from none of this, as player movement in RE8 was already run and gun, and the spastic and unpredictable movements of most enemies in RE8 ensures that they are still a threat to deal with either in or out of VR. I would say my VR aim was still better here when playing flat, but it feels to me that the ammo drops have been better adjusted here to balance the game for VR. Thankfully, gunplay here is also awesome and definitely taken to the next level with the use of both the dual sense weighted triggers, HD haptics, and also the head haptics, which are used brilliantly here. Case in point, unloading the shotgun gives not just a kick to both controllers, but also punches you in the head, offering a tactile quality to firing off a shotgun that I've never felt in any game ever, and that had me smiling like an idiot in gamer heaven. Outside of the haptics, guns here in RE8 feel great across the board, with complete two-handed manual reloads that were smooth enough to keep up with the more frantic combat that the game threw at me, and definitely added a level of badassery to the combat that only VR can deliver. Further to this, melee combat has gotten a real upgrade here in VR, for in addition to using the knife to fend off enemies, players can now also attach a bayonet to their shotgun, in addition to also being able to block and punch. Now, I don't advise you ever let enemies get that close, but it's nice to have it here. Moving on to the crafting side of things, and again, RE8 looks to go to the RE4 well, bringing back the traveling vendor that once again tends to pop in the most bizarre locations that you really have to sit back and ask yourself if he's really setting up in the best locations to run a business from. Regardless, I absolutely love seeing the return of the vendor, as it provided a game loop that was sorely missing in RE7. Once again, RE8 is filled with treasures, mini missions, loot drops, and yes, the ability to kill crows for cash drops. All of which can be used at the vendor to purchase new weapons, weapon attachments, weapon upgrades, consumables, and crafting recipes. In addition, later stages in the game will see the vendor open up a cooking section, offering players the ability to bring in meat from downed animals in return for dishes that grant permanent character buffs. Outside of vendor crafting, players will be very familiar with the tried and true ability to craft healing potion, ammunition, and other consumables from resources that they scrounge in the world, such as scrap metal, gunpowder, chem fluid, and of course, the always delicious green herb. Higher difficulties see limited health and ammo drops, so crafting can be an absolute necessity for survival, an aspect I absolutely loved in Resident Evil 4 and 5, and one I'm happy to see RE8 has nailed the balance of. For higher difficulties means every bullet counts, and that makes scrounging every corner of the world an absolute must. And it must be highlighted that as a VR title, rarely have we seen such a deep and polished action title brought to any headset. I mean, truly, even the almighty Half Life Alyx simply lacks anywhere near the depth and gameplay mechanics, freedom of movement, or scale of world seen here in RE8, making Alyx at times feel like a tech demo in comparison with its overly safe movement system and simplistic upgrade tree. Don't get me wrong, guys, I love Half Life Alyx and it is definitely a quintessential VR title, but Resident Evil 8 VR feels like the next step that we've been looking for. Taking a look at the visuals, and Resident Evil 8 Village is simply beautiful as a VR title, and Capcom should be applauded for what they've pulled off here. In fact, between the three launch titles of Horizon Call of the Mountain, GT7, and RE8, it is this title that has impressed me the most. RE8 in VR never feels like a visually dumbed down version of the flat game. Right from the starting menu, as I sat in the opening farmer's field on launch day, I found my jaded VR brain simply awestruck with the level of graphical quality in front of me. But could the game possibly deliver this beyond a curated starting menu? Yes. Yes, it could. Resident Evil 8 Village in flat is a truly beautiful AAA experience, yet in VR, walking around the variety of environments ranging from large outside vistas and rustic village locales to the beauty of rich castle interiors and the murky depths of dark dungeons is an absolute experience that I have never felt in VR. I mean, the sheer level of texture detail on absolutely everything in this world, it's all here, and I often found myself simply poring over detail after detail with my flashlight. From the dynamic lighting and particle effects to glass reflections and character animations, absolutely every painstaking detail is here in VR, and the effect is a level of world immersion I've never felt before, and I found myself continually being impressed and surprised during my 10-hour playthrough. Now, how is the PS5 pulling off these visuals? Well, eye tracking and the use of dynamic foveated rendering is certainly on display here, and that combined with some fantastic dynamic resolution at work to ensure objects that might not be completely crisp at a distance have that detail when we get up close to them. No, this isn't as crisp as the flat version, but it was never going to be. However, despite some softness in the complex textures at a distance, RE8 manages to avoid much in the way of pop-in, jagged edges, or any of the VR concessions that we have come to expect. That being said, the game does use reprojection to hit the required frame rates, and it is quite noticeable when smooth turning. In fact, though it never bothered me, I would recommend that those with weaker VR legs stick to turning in real life or using the click turn option, as the motion blur from the reprojection could make some uncomfortable here, as this is certainly not the smoothest game at launch and is very obvious when compared with the smoothness of The Walking Dead Saints and Sinners Chapter 2 running at a native 90 FPS. However, the level of graphical detail on display here for me is absolutely worth these concessions. RE8 completely surpassed my expectations for this generation of PSVR and stands as a benchmark title for other developers to look to when considering going the VR hybrid route with their next AAA title. Sound-wise, RE8 is unsurprisingly first-rate, offering a rich and complex 3D sound mix, bringing Village to life like never before. And for someone who played the game a few times before, playing again in VR with this mix was a completely different experience. Yes, tracking incoming enemies was easier, but it was the little details, like torches burning in the distance, the brushing of swinging bodies in the trees, or the creaks of dilapidated buildings that just fill this sound mix and truly take RE8 to an audio level that we've rarely gotten in VR. Further to this, for those more prone to the horror aspects of VR, prepare to get your butt puckered, as RE8 is a horror masterpiece in audio design, from its slight musical cues and shock and awe timing to its gruesome monster noises and pitch-perfect voice acting. Finishing the audio package here, I must give special attention to the gun sounds here, as they are some of the best I have heard in a while in or out of VR, offering a satisfying punch to the whole combat system, with the shotgun being a particular highlight with a visceral blast that would make even Doom Guy proud. And that brings me to my final thoughts and review score. What can I say? I absolutely love Resident Evil 8 Village in VR. Those looking for the story-rich horror of 7 may find this title lacking a bit, as this is certainly more fantastical in its delivery. But for those looking for more of a return to the combat game loop and pacing of the 4th or 5th entry in the series, I think you will find RE8 right up your alley. This is a masterclass in porting a AAA title to VR, and it makes it the only way to play the game if you have the means to get your hands on a PSVR 2, as it simply elevates every single aspect of the game. Of course, it's not without its visual concessions in VR, but the end result is truly breathtaking in the headset, as we have rarely seen this level of graphical richness in any VR game. The VR Grid gives Resident Evil 8 Village a 9.5 out of 10. When I talk about next-gen VR and what I hope the PSVR 2 would bring to VR, this right here is what I was talking about. Move over, Alex. Your crown has finally been taken.